as an administrator, I've built my expertise around thinking about what it means to think about people who are not like me, right? And this is important to me because when I moved here in 2010, I moved from Chicago, which is where I got my PhD, and also my master's. And before that, I was in the UK. Before that, I was in Paris. Before that, I was in India, which is where I was born and raised. And in most of these places, I have not been of the dominant majority, right? Outside of India, where I'm definitely part of the dominant majority, in places like the UK, France, and the US, I am part of a minority. And it never occurred to me while I was in India how someone who's not like me feels to be in a room, right? What does it mean to walk into a room and to not see anyone who looks like yourself? Or what does it mean to go into a meeting and suddenly people say, what a great accent, or I don't understand what you're saying, or they speak to you really slowly because they assume something about you based on how you look. And that consciousness started developing as I, ironically, became of your age, kind of, sort of your age. So I went to, I was very bratty. I'm an academic brat. So my parents are both university professors in a medical school and an engineering school. And I went to school, undergrad school, early, right? And when I went to the UK, I was 16 and a half, 17. That's when I went to my undergrad. And that was the first time it hit me like a ton of bricks that people make judgments about you when they don't know you, right? They make assumptions about you, and that is about each and every one of you. It doesn't matter who you are. People read you before they can even know what your name is, right? And some people are read to their advantage, and some people are read to their disadvantage. And they don't have much control over it, right? They don't get to say, that's not who I am. You are wrong. Their book is read already. And I started becoming aware of that when I was in my late teens, when it started happening to me and I felt a loss of control. Right? When I was part of the dominant majority in India, and while India does not have what is an established race system in places in the West, India has a very established caste system, which works very much like the racial system where, you know, the Brahmins are they self-identified at one point in the past as being the superior people, and they made a hierarchy in which everyone else kind of was lower than them. So technically, I am of that upper echelon by birth, right? So I didn't really recognize my privilege as my privilege. I just thought, well, this is life when I was in India. And it was when I went to the UK where the caste system did not really apply, but things like the race system applied, things like gender applied, that I started recognizing that there is something weird that is going on suddenly, that people are not interested in sitting next to me or chatting with me or rooming with me because not because of who I am, but because of who they believe I might be, right? And where those beliefs came from started becoming more important to me in terms of wanting to understand that. So that is part of my administrative responsibility at Coastal, to bring people, not just students, but people in general, students, faculty, staff, to understand how so much of what we do in our lives is make assumptions about other people. And those assumptions can firm up and they become stereotypes. And we have to unlearn in a real systematic way what those stereotypes are, what those assumptions are. And when people say they're woke, or when people believe they're woke, that's great, you know, good for them. But I always say a safe way, a humble way to approach this reality is that none of us is woke enough. None of us can ever be woke enough. And being able to say that about ourselves makes us willing to learn and change our own ways, right? I come in from, let's say, from the North. When I came in from the North or the Midwest in 2010, I made a whole lot of assumptions about the South, right? From movies. I will blame Hollywood, I will blame novels, I will blame all the stereotypes that were offered to me, right, by media. And I was like, yeah, I have to be really scared in the South, and it's like awful people out there because, you know, I watch these movies. And ironically, I would say some of the most prejudiced engagements I've had have been in the Midwest or in New York or in London, which are super metropolitan, super cosmopolitan places. And that recognition made me shatter my own stereotypes, right? So I had to do this whole difficult process of unlearning. What DEI work does, DEI being diversity, equity, and inclusion. Wow, you all have these nice chubby chalks. My class has disgusting chalks, I have to say, and I do like writing with chalks. Right, so this is diversity, and I'm sure you've all heard this in different ways, in different contexts. You might also hear this as JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. So depending on how you roll with the Star Wars mythology, you can go with DEI or JEDI work. But what DEI work essentially is about, but what people mean when they cut to the chase, when they say DEI work, is, are you consciously, actively thinking about people's differences, right? People's differences in backgrounds, people's differences in experiences, in their gender identities, in their sexual identities, in their practices when it comes to religious or secular faith, right? What all are you consciously thinking about? Or if you're not consciously thinking about it, are you unconsciously making judgments about people based on these aspects, right? And if you don't do any of that, why not, right? Why is it that you're not aware when you walk into a room that you're part of a majority? Or do you suddenly feel uncomfortable when someone draws attention to that fact, or you resent them when someone draws attention to the fact? So DEI work asks us to become more critically self-conscious, right? And when we do that to ourselves, when we flip that lens on ourselves, we are better able to understand the world as it exists for a lot of people. Employers started taking notice that people whom they didn't design their workspace for are in these workspaces, and they've had to kind of crunch up their shoulders and adjust and be accommodating of all these differences that they have to read and respond to. Whereas the people for whom the room was designed, for whom the business was designed, have not really bothered to do that, right? So there is this great inequity of labor. The most important factor in these three, I would say, is the one that is least attended to, right? Who does the maximum lifting in an environment and why, right? And by lifting, I mean labor. Who is doing the most work and why? And how much of that work is invisible and why? So the people for whom a room isn't designed have to do a lot of work. One, to get in the room. Two, to stay in the room. Three, to be treated as an equal within that room. That room could be anything. It could be a university. So first-generation students have a much harder time staying in the room because the room was not designed with them in mind, right? A university was designed with literally 17th century ideas as to what makes a person intelligent, right? 5 centuries down the road, we have not done too much to change. We've added more people, so now women can come into a university. During my mother's lifetime, people were, and she's a doctor, she's an award-winning double MD, so she has brains, right? But she was not allowed into a whole bunch of medical universities. The person who was my primary advisor in my PhD program was the first woman out of Princeton University to get a graduate degree, right? She's still alive. She's probably as old as your grandmother's might be, right? So I bring this to our attention because universities were not designed for women students. Universities were not designed for people of color. Universities were not designed for people who did not speak certain languages or certain dialects in their homes. And yet today, if you look around this room itself, you will see the vast majority of us in this room, and I include myself in this and your instructor, this room was not designed for us. Right? So what do we do? How do we make that known? That the system has to change, the room has to change. It's not we that needs to sit there and accommodate and change and adjust our lives, right? But for centuries, that's what has happened. And finally, in the late 20th century, people started saying, wake up. Wake up to the reality that the rooms have to change. People don't have to keep repressing, suppressing, hiding behind lies so that the room does not adjust. If there is mold in the room, change the room, right? Instead of saying, well, your nose is weak, you're a weakling, give me 50, right? That's not how it works. So a lot of the work that you will hear about as you get through different classes, different years at Coastal and also beyond at your employers, at internships, is how this stuff is important. But most people don't tell you why it's important, right? You'll hear phrases like diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're really inclusive. You'll hear things like we're not equal opportunity employer, and these all just sound like catchphrases, and that's what they are. Just like the term woke is a catchphrase. But what does it mean to work your butts off to be woke? Nobody is actually going to tell you how to do that, because that means actually retracing a history which most of us don't like to do. For people to be considered, quote, marginalized, for people to be considered minorities, for people to be considered underrepresented, all of these phrases are also catchphrases. There is a flip side. The other side of that coin is there are majorities. There are people who are dominant. For the marginalized, there is a dominant counterpart. For the minority, there is somebody who is participating like they're in the majority. And most importantly, when we use terms like underserved, the flip side that we don't like talking about is that there are people who are overserved, right? And we never use those phrases because that makes people, quote, uncomfortable. We come right back to that feelings, right? Those same people who feel uncomfortable being told that there is a history of systematic overserving communities, those same people very often might look down on things like feelings. Right? I literally was driving behind a truck that said, F your feelings. Right, only it was not F. And I was laughing because it's funny, right? And being an English person, I really like musicality. So if I had not become an English major, I would have been, I like to think, a costume and fashion designer. But if I could not have cut it there because I don't know how to stitch a button, I would have been in music, right? But I have a sense of sound. So F Your Feelings, I thought was great because it had this sort of punchy sound, gut punch, FF. But people's feelings are always protected, right? We want to protect them. Who protects them is the important bit that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is drawing attention to. Equity, diversity and inclusion kind of go hand in hand, and this long arrow is deliberate because it takes a lot more work to be equitable, right? It takes a lot more work to say, oh, I have a much larger piece of the pie than I need, but I'm just used to having this larger piece of the pie, so I just think I'm entitled to it, or I have earned it. Equity means thinking about how there is unequal distribution across centuries, across cultures, and what we can do to prevent that in future, right? And it's not the same thing as equality, and we'll talk about that more generally. The accident of birth none of us can control, right? I had no control over the fact that I was born into relative privilege in a family in India. But if I didn't have the opportunity to travel or to go into another school or another neighborhood, I would not have widened my horizons. So this is part of what makes it so difficult for us, right? So you can't, as a 5-year-old, you can't tell your parents, listen, I want a more diverse environment in which I want to be educated. Your parents will say, shut up, you be quiet until you're under my roof, right? Like we have all these narratives where whoever is taking care of us or paying our bills has a lot of control over our lives maybe, but even they don't have control over their situations, right? Even they are kind of, I don't want to use the word trapped, but even they're confined by a lot of inequitable realities that they have to work with. So a lot of this responsibility, the labor of growing, falls upon young adults, which is why you are primarily the target of a lot of this education. Right? I cannot change my grandma, trust me. The kind of, she says, it's like, wow, why? Why do we have to deal with her? But the change is not going to come because grandma started thinking differently. The change is going to come because you become more aware of this world that exists in which you have to function. And it's best for you and for the world if you function with thoughtfulness, right? You've probably heard the phrase mindfulness. It's like very yoga. But what mindfulness, just like feelings and sensitivity, is drawing attention to is the fact that we do a lot of things thoughtlessly, right? We do a lot of things just because we've been doing it and we've not wanted to think about it. But now we're being forced to. If you have questions about people who are different than you, don't repress those questions, right? But think about how you ask those questions and ensure that you empower the person to address those questions on their terms, right? So don't repress your differences, don't suppress them, and don't alienate people who you don't feel are similar to you, because that's easier.